There's a quiet realization that comes at some point, that much of what disturbs you isn't as random as it feels. Words linger longer than they should. Small moments echo in your mind. Reactions rise before you've had time to think. You try to stay composed. You tell yourself it doesn't matter, but something still gets through. And what unsettles you isn't just the feeling. It's how easily it happens. How something so small can reach so deep. You begin to question what strength actually is. Not the version that looks controlled on the outside, but the kind that holds steady internally. Because suppressing everything doesn't work, ignoring it doesn't work, and reacting to everything only makes it worse, so something doesn't add up. And that's where a deeper truth begins to surface. As Carl Jung put it, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." That idea shifts the focus completely. It moves the center of your life away from what happens and toward how you relate to it. And once you see that, even slightly, something changes. You stop looking outward for stability. You start paying attention to how your mind interprets what happens. Not to control everything, but to understand it more clearly. Because real strength isn't about becoming unaffected. It's about becoming aware enough that what happens no longer defines you. You've probably told yourself that what hurts you is what people do. Their words, their actions, their absence when you needed them most. It feels obvious. Someone disrespects you, and anger rises before you can even process it. Someone walks away, and it feels like something inside you has been taken with them. Someone ignores you, and a quiet tension builds, as if your worth has just been measured. These reactions feel automatic, almost built into the situation itself. But if that were completely true, then everyone would react the same way to the same events, and they don't. Some people remain steady in moments that completely shake others. Some hear the same words and feel nothing at all. That difference isn't random. It points to something internal, something most people rarely stop to examine. The moment you begin to notice this, a shift starts to happen. You realize that two people can go through the same situation and walk away with completely different emotional outcomes. One carries it for days, replaying every detail. The other lets it pass almost immediately. The event hasn't changed. What changed is the interpretation. And that's where things become uncomfortable, because it challenges the belief that your emotional state is controlled by the outside world. It suggests something deeper, that what you feel is not just a reaction, but something shaped, something constructed, a meaning assigned so quickly that it feels like reality itself. But meaning is not fixed. It's influenced by memory, expectation, fear, and identity. And once you begin to see that, you understand why the same moment can either disturb you deeply or pass through you without leaving a mark. This is where most people hesitate, because accepting this means giving up a certain kind of certainty. It's easier to believe that the world is the cause of your inner state. That way, the responsibility stays outside of you. But the Stoics saw this differently. They understood that between what happens and how you feel, there is a space where interpretation forms, often without your awareness. And in that space lies the real source of your suffering. It's not just the event, it's what you make it mean. And that realization is uncomfortable, because it puts you face to face with your own patterns. The tendency to take things personally. The habit of assuming rejection where there was simply indifference. The quiet need to be seen, approved, validated. These patterns don't appear out of nowhere. They've been built over time, reinforced so often that they feel natural. But once you start paying attention, you begin to see how fast your mind moves. A delayed response becomes rejection. A neutral expression becomes disapproval. A disagreement becomes a personal attack. None of these meanings exist in the event itself, yet they feel real enough to trigger a full emotional response. And that's where the real vulnerability lies, not in what happens, but in how quickly meaning is assigned. Because once meaning is attached, the reaction follows almost instantly, and by the time you notice it, you're already inside it. That's why it feels so hard to control, because you're not just reacting, you're reacting to something that has already been shaped in your mind. As this awareness grows, something begins to shift. You start to see that your first reaction is not the full picture, it's just the first layer. And between that reaction and your response, there is a gap, small but powerful. In that gap, you can begin to separate what actually happened from what you assumed it meant. You can question it, you can slow it down. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything. Not instantly, not perfectly, but enough to weaken the automatic hold these moments have over you. Over time, this changes how you experience things. Situations that once felt overwhelming begin to feel more manageable. Reactions that once felt immediate begin to slow down. You don't stop feeling, but you stop being carried away by what you feel. And that's where a different kind of strength begins to form. Not the kind that resists or suppresses, but the kind that understands. Because when you understand that your experience is shaped by interpretation, you also begin to see that interpretation can be examined, adjusted, refined. You don't eliminate pain, but you reduce the unnecessary layers around it. And the more you practice this, the more something inside you starts to stabilize. Not because the world has changed, but because your relationship to it has. You stop depending on everything going right in order to feel steady. You stop handing over control of your inner state to every external moment. And that's where things begin to shift in a real, noticeable way. You still experience life fully, but it no longer controls you in the same way. If this way of thinking is starting to make sense to you, don't let it stay as just another idea. Stay with it. Keep exploring it. Consider subscribing, not as a habit, but as a conscious step toward understanding yourself more clearly and becoming someone who is no longer easily shaken by what they cannot control. And this is where the deeper shift begins. Not in controlling the world, but in understanding your own mind. Not in avoiding difficult situations, but in seeing them without unnecessary distortion. Because once you reduce the distortion, the intensity of the reaction often follows. And what's left is something quieter, more stable, less reactive. A way of moving through life where you're no longer at the mercy of every external moment, but grounded in a perspective that you've taken the time to understand. Think about how quickly a moment can expand beyond what it actually is. A single comment, a brief tone shift, a look that might not even have been intentional, and somehow it lingers. It follows you into the next hour, the next conversation, sometimes even the next day. On the surface it seems small, almost insignificant, yet the effect it creates feels anything but small. There's a weight to it, a kind of emotional residue that doesn't match the size of the event itself. And that mismatch is where something important begins to reveal itself. Because if the moment was truly as small as it appeared, it wouldn't stay with you the way it does. Something else is happening beneath it, something that doesn't belong entirely to the present. That something else is rarely obvious in the moment. It doesn't announce itself. It operates quietly, almost automatically, shaping your reaction before you even have time to question it. What you feel seems immediate, direct, justified, but if you slow it down, even slightly, you start to notice that the reaction didn't come from nowhere. It connected to something already there. A memory you didn't consciously recall, an expectation you didn't realize you were holding, a belief about yourself that has been sitting quietly in the background, waiting for confirmation. And when that small moment appears, it doesn't just exist on its own. It activates everything attached to it. This is where the experience begins to shift from reality to interpretation. The comment is no longer just a comment. It becomes a sign of disrespect. The tone is no longer just a tone. It becomes evidence of disapproval. The look is no longer just a look. It becomes a judgment. And once that interpretation forms, the emotional response follows naturally, almost inevitably. But what feels like a direct reaction to reality is actually a reaction to meaning. And meaning, unlike events, is not fixed. It is constructed, often so quickly and so unconsciously, that it feels inseparable from the event itself. As this process continues, it becomes easier to see why certain moments affect you more than they logically should. It's not because you're overly sensitive or lacking control. It's because the moment is no longer just a moment. It's part of a larger internal structure, a structure built from past experiences, reinforced by repeated interpretations, and rarely examined in a direct way. And as long as that structure remains in place, every new situation that resembles it, even slightly, will trigger the same response. Not because it deserves to, but because it fits the pattern. This is where most people unknowingly lose control, not in the moment itself, but in the automatic meaning they assign to it. They believe they are reacting to what is happening, when in reality, they are reacting to what they think it means. And because that meaning feels so real, so immediate, it rarely gets questioned. It becomes the lens through which everything is seen. And once you're looking through that lens, every new experience starts to confirm what you already believe. The pattern strengthens, the reaction becomes faster, the gap between event and interpretation becomes almost invisible. Breaking that pattern doesn't happen by force. It doesn't come from trying to suppress your reaction or pretending not to feel it. It begins with awareness, with recognizing that the first meaning your mind offers is not necessarily the only one, that there is a difference between what happened and what you concluded from it. And in that difference, there is space. Space to question, to reconsider, to see the moment from a slightly different angle. That space may be small, but it's enough to begin changing the pattern. As this awareness develops, the automatic nature of your reactions starts to slow down. Not completely, not immediately, but enough for you to notice them as they happen. And once you notice them, you're no longer fully inside them, you're observing them. That shift from being the reaction to observing the reaction is where control begins to return. Not control over what happens, but control over how deeply it affects you. This is what gives you the ability to reshape meaning, not by forcing a positive interpretation, but by loosening the grip of the default one, by allowing for the possibility that the situation may not carry the weight you initially assigned to it. And in doing so, the emotional intensity often begins to decrease, not because the situation changed, but because your relationship to it did. As Seneca observed, we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. That line doesn't dismiss real pain. It reveals how much of that pain is shaped by the stories we attach to it. And once you begin to see those stories for what they are, not fixed truths but interpretations, you start to reclaim something that was always there, but rarely used with intention, the ability to see differently, and in seeing differently, to experience differently. There's a point where all of this stops being just an idea and starts becoming something you practice. Not occasionally, not when it's convenient, but consistently, because understanding that your interpretation shapes your experience is one thing, but applying that understanding in real time is something else entirely. This is where Stoicism shifts from something you agree with to something you actually do. It becomes training. Quiet, internal training that doesn't rely on perfect conditions, but on repetition, on catching yourself in the moment, on noticing when your mind begins to drift into exaggeration, assumption, or distortion, and choosing to bring it back, not forcefully, not aggressively, but deliberately. That distance is where clarity begins. Not the kind of clarity that eliminates emotion, but the kind that prevents emotion from taking over completely. It allows you to see the situation with less distortion, less added meaning, less unnecessary weight. And when you see things more clearly, the emotional intensity often changes on its own. Not because you're trying to reduce it, but because you're no longer amplifying it. The mind tends to intensify what it focuses on, especially when that focus is driven by fear, insecurity, or expectation. But when you shift your focus toward what is actually present, rather than what you assume it means, the intensity begins to settle. But this kind of responsibility is also what creates stability. Because when you realize that your estimate is something you can examine, something you can question, something you can adjust, you stop feeling completely at the mercy of what happens. You begin to see that while you can't control events, you can influence how deeply they affect you. And that influence doesn't come from force. It comes from clarity, from seeing things as they are, not as they immediately feel. The challenge is that clarity is not always comfortable. In many cases, it requires letting go of interpretations that feel familiar, even if they're not accurate. It requires stepping away from patterns of thinking that have been reinforced over time, and that can feel uncertain at first. Because without those patterns, there's a moment where you don't immediately know what to think or how to react. But that moment is not a weakness, it's a space where you're no longer bound by automatic interpretation, where you have the opportunity to respond differently. Most people avoid this space without realizing it. They move quickly from event to reaction, filling the gap with assumptions, judgments, and conclusions that feel solid but haven't been examined. And in doing so, they maintain a sense of certainty, even if that certainty leads to unnecessary suffering. Because uncertainty, even when it opens the door to clarity, can feel uncomfortable. It requires patience. It requires a willingness to not immediately define what something means. But when you begin to stay in that space, even briefly, something changes. You start to see how much of your previous reactions were based on interpretation rather than fact. You start to recognize patterns in your thinking that you didn't notice before. And once you recognize them, they lose some of their automatic power. They don't disappear completely, but they become visible. And what is visible can be worked with. Over time, this becomes a kind of internal discipline, not rigid, not forced, but consistent. A habit of returning to what is actually happening rather than what your mind suggests is happening. A habit of questioning your first interpretation, not to dismiss it, but to understand it more clearly. And in that process, the emotional charge that once felt overwhelming begins to feel more manageable. You don't become unaffected. You become less easily carried away. You still notice what happens. You still feel the impact. But the impact doesn't define your entire state. It doesn't dictate your next thought, your next reaction, your next decision without your awareness. And that awareness is where your stability begins to form. Because when you see clearly, you reduce the space for unnecessary suffering, not by eliminating difficulty, but by removing the layers that amplify it. And those layers are often built from interpretation, from assumption, from the habit of adding meaning before fully understanding what's in front of you. So the practice continues, not as a one-time realization, but as an ongoing process, a return to clarity, again and again. And with each return, the hold that external events have over you becomes slightly weaker. Not because the world has changed, but because the way you see it has. Clarity has a way of stripping things down to what they actually are, and that's exactly why most people resist it. Not consciously, not in a way they would openly admit, but in subtle, almost invisible ways. Because clarity removes illusion, and illusion, even when it creates discomfort, often feels safer than facing something uncertain or unfamiliar. It gives you something to hold on to, even if that something is distorted. It tells you a story that feels consistent, even if it isn't entirely true. And once that story is in place, it becomes easier to navigate the world through it, rather than questioning it every time something challenges it. This dependency doesn't always look obvious. It doesn't always appear as a clear need for approval or validation. Sometimes it's more subtle. It's the need for things to go a certain way in order for you to feel okay. The expectation that others will respond in a way that aligns with your internal standard. The quiet assumption that your environment should match your preferences. And when it doesn't, something inside shifts. Not dramatically at first, but enough to create tension. Enough to pull your attention outward, toward what you cannot control, instead of inward, toward what you can understand. As this pattern continues, it becomes familiar, almost normal. You begin to measure your internal state against external conditions without realizing it. A good interaction lifts you, a negative one lowers you. Silence creates doubt, attention creates relief, and without noticing it, your stability starts to fluctuate based on variables that are outside your influence. This is where vulnerability quietly takes root, not in the events themselves, but in the reliance on them to maintain your sense of balance. The Stoics approached this differently. They didn't try to remove emotion from their experience. They didn't aim to become indifferent in a detached, lifeless way. What they focused on was dependency. They understood that as long as your inner state depends on something external, you are exposed to it, not occasionally, but constantly, because the external world is unpredictable by nature. People change, situations shift, outcomes vary, and if your stability is tied to those changes, then your internal state will change with them. This is why they emphasize the importance of grounding yourself in what is within your control, not as a concept, but as a daily practice, a way of returning your attention to something stable, something consistent, something that doesn't fluctuate based on external behavior. And that doesn't mean ignoring the world or pretending that nothing affects you. It means recognizing where your influence begins and where it ends. It means understanding that while you can experience what happens, you don't have to be defined by it. There is a certain honesty required in this process, because it involves looking at the ways you rely on things outside of yourself, even when that reliance feels justified. It involves noticing how often your mood, your thoughts, your sense of self shifts in response to something external, and that observation can feel uncomfortable at first, not because it reveals something negative, but because it reveals something dependent, something that hasn't been fully examined. But once you begin to see it clearly, the dynamic starts to change. You realize that the instability you've been experiencing isn't coming solely from what happens around you, but from how much weight you've placed on it, from how much authority you've given it over your internal state. And that realization doesn't weaken you. It gives you a point of return, a place to begin shifting your focus back towards something that belongs to you. As Seneca observed, he who depends on himself is the happiest man. That idea isn't about isolation or rejecting connection. It's about reducing unnecessary reliance on things you cannot control. It's about building a kind of internal stability that doesn't collapse when external conditions change. And that stability doesn't come from removing emotion. It comes from understanding it, from seeing where it originates, what it attaches to, and how it moves through you. When you begin to reduce dependency, something subtle shifts. You stop waiting for things to align perfectly in order to feel steady. You stop needing constant reassurance to maintain your sense of self. You still notice what happens. You still care. But the impact doesn't reach as deeply as it once did, because it no longer determines your foundation. And this is where the question becomes more direct. If your stability is no longer tied to external behavior, if your sense of self is no longer dependent on how others respond, if your internal state is no longer shaped by things you cannot control, then what exactly is left for the world to take from you? And that anchor is not found outside. It's built gradually, through awareness, through understanding, through the repeated act of returning your attention to what you can actually influence. It's not something that appears all at once. It develops over time as you begin to recognize the patterns that once controlled you and slowly loosen their hold. In that process, the world doesn't become easier, but your relationship to it becomes clearer. And in that clarity, the need to depend on it for your stability begins to fade. It's easy to misunderstand what all of this leads to. When people hear about becoming less affected, less reactive, less dependent on external events, they often assume it means becoming cold, detached, unfeeling, as if the goal is to move through life untouched by anything, disconnected from experience itself. But that's not strength. That's avoidance wearing a mask of control. Real strength doesn't come from shutting things down. It comes from understanding them so clearly that they no longer overwhelm you. You don't stop feeling. You stop being carried away by what you feel. There's a difference, and it's more important than it seems at first. Being carried away means your reaction defines you in that moment. It takes over your thinking, your perception, your sense of self. It pulls you into a narrative that feels absolute, even when it isn't. But when you're not carried away, the feeling is still there. You notice it, you experience it, but you're not inside it in the same way. You're aware of it, and that awareness creates space. That space is where everything begins to change, because once there's space, there's a gap between what happens and what you conclude about yourself because of it. And that gap is where most people struggle. They collapse the two into one. Something happens, and immediately it becomes personal. A rejection becomes a statement about your worth. A criticism becomes proof that you're not enough. A loss becomes a reflection of something missing within you. But those conclusions are not inherent in the event. They are added. And once they're added, they shape everything that follows. The emotion becomes heavier. The experience becomes more difficult to process. Not because of what happened, but because of what it now means. And meaning, when left unchecked, tends to expand. It grows beyond the original moment, connecting to other thoughts, other memories, other beliefs. Before long, you're no longer reacting to a single event. You're reacting to an entire network of interpretations that have been building over time. This is where precision becomes essential, not in a rigid or analytical sense, but in a clear, grounded way of seeing. Precision means noticing the difference between the event and the story you tell about it. It means recognizing when you've added something that wasn't there. And that recognition doesn't remove the feeling, but it changes your relationship to it. It prevents the feeling from defining the entire experience. This is what allows you to experience difficult moments without collapsing under them. You can feel the discomfort of rejection without concluding that you are unworthy. You can hear criticism without internalizing it as a flaw in your identity. You can lose something important without losing your sense of self in the process. These are not abstract ideas. They are practical shifts in perception that change how you move through life. As this way of seeing becomes more natural, you start to notice how much of your previous suffering was not caused by reality itself, but by the meaning you layered on top of it. And that realization doesn't dismiss your past experiences. It reframes them. It shows you where the intensity came from, where the weight was added, where the reaction became larger than the event itself. This is not about blaming yourself for how you felt. It's about understanding the process behind it. Because once you understand the process, you're no longer completely controlled by it. You can see it as it happens. You can recognize when meaning is being assigned too quickly, too heavily, too absolutely. And in that recognition, there is choice. That choice doesn't always feel obvious at first. It can be subtle, almost quiet. A moment where you pause instead of reacting immediately. A moment where you question the conclusion forming in your mind. A moment where you allow the feeling to exist without attaching it to your identity. Those moments may seem small, but they accumulate. They create a different pattern over time, and that pattern leads to a different kind of stability. Not the kind that depends on everything going well, but the kind that remains even when things don't. Because your sense of self is no longer tied to every outcome, every interaction, every moment of feedback. It's grounded in something deeper, something that isn't constantly shifting, This is where the idea becomes clearer. Strength is not about eliminating vulnerability. It's about understanding it. It's about knowing where it comes from, how it forms, and how it can be influenced. And once you understand that, vulnerability stops being something that controls you. It becomes something you can work with, something you can observe without being consumed by it. As Carl Jung pointed out, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. That line captures the essence of what's happening here. When you're unaware of how you're assigning meaning, it feels like your reactions are inevitable, like they are simply the result of what happened. But when you bring that process into awareness, it stops being automatic. It becomes visible, and what is visible can be understood. What is understood can be adjusted. Not perfectly, not instantly, but gradually. And in that gradual shift, the hold that these interpretations have over you begins to weaken. You still experience life. You still feel its impact. But you are no longer defined by every moment. You begin to move differently, not by resisting what happens, but by seeing it more clearly. Not by suppressing your reactions, but by understanding them. And in that understanding, something steady begins to form. A way of being that isn't easily shaken, not because nothing affects you, but because what affects you no longer defines you. And in that moment, everything feels immediate. The reaction rises quickly, almost before you're aware of it. There's no clear separation between what happens and how you feel about it. It blends together and you move with it. That's the default. That's how most people live, reacting in real time without ever noticing the process behind it. But once you've started to understand that there is a process, something changes, even if only slightly, even if only for a second. That second matters more than it seems, because within that brief moment, there is an opportunity, not to stop the reaction entirely, but to see it as it begins, to notice the shift instead of being fully inside it. And that noticing creates distance, not a dramatic distance, not something that removes the feeling completely, but enough to observe it, enough to recognize that what you're experiencing is not just the event, but your interpretation forming around it. This is where training becomes real, not in theory, but in practice. The ability to pause, even briefly, before fully committing to a reaction. To ask yourself what is actually happening without immediately accepting the first answer your mind offers. To look at the situation as it is, before adding meaning to it. These are small actions, almost invisible from the outside, but they change the entire internal experience. At first, this pause feels unnatural, because you're interrupting something that has been automatic for a long time. The mind wants to move quickly. It wants to complete the story, assign meaning, create a clear narrative. Pausing slows that process down, and that can feel uncomfortable. It introduces a kind of uncertainty, but within that uncertainty, there is clarity. Because you're no longer rushing to a conclusion, you're allowing yourself to see more before deciding what it means. As you continue to practice this, the pause becomes more familiar. Not longer, necessarily, but more accessible. You begin to recognize the early signs of a reaction forming. The tension, the shift in thought, the impulse to interpret quickly. And instead of moving with it immediately, you stay with it just long enough to see it clearly. That clarity doesn't eliminate the reaction, but it changes your relationship to it. You're no longer completely identified with what you feel. You're aware of it, but you're also aware of yourself observing it. And in that awareness, there is space. Space to choose how you respond. Space to question whether the meaning you're assigning is accurate. Space to decide whether this moment deserves the level of intensity you're about to give it. This is where control begins. Not control over what happens, but control over how deeply you allow it to affect you. And that control is not forced. It's not about suppressing your reaction or pretending not to feel. It's about understanding the process well enough that you're no longer carried by it automatically. You're participating in it consciously. Over time, this participation becomes more natural. The distance between stimulus and reaction becomes more consistent. Not because the situations have changed, but because your awareness has. You begin to experience moments that would have previously triggered a strong reaction, and instead of being pulled into them, you observe them. You still feel something, but it doesn't escalate in the same way. And in that space, something important begins to form, a sense of stability that doesn't depend on everything going smoothly. Because even when things don't go smoothly, you're not reacting in the same automatic way. You're seeing more, understanding more, choosing more deliberately. This is what creates freedom. Not freedom from difficulty, but freedom within it. The ability to experience something without being completely shaped by it. The ability to respond instead of react. The ability to remain grounded even when something unexpected happens. And that ownership changes how you move through life. You're no longer waiting for situations to be easier in order to feel stable. You're developing stability within yourself, regardless of what happens. Not perfectly, not consistently at first, but enough to notice the difference. That difference grows with practice. Each moment of awareness reinforces it. Each pause makes the next one slightly easier. Each observation weakens the automatic pull of reaction. And over time, what once felt immediate and uncontrollable begins to feel manageable. You start to trust that you can handle what arises, not because you can control it, but because you can engage with it differently. And that trust creates a quiet confidence. Not loud, not obvious, but steady. Because you've seen what happens when you slow down. You've experienced the space between event and reaction. And you've realized that within that space, there is something that cannot be easily disturbed. Something that belongs to you. At some point, without a dramatic moment or a clear line you can point to, things begin to feel different. Not in the world itself, because the world continues as it always has. People still act unpredictably. Situations still shift without warning. Words are still said, sometimes carelessly, sometimes intentionally. None of that disappears, but your relationship to it begins to change in a way that is difficult to explain until you experience it directly. It's not that you stop noticing what happens, it's that what happens no longer reaches you in the same way. There's no immediate collapse, no sudden tightening in your chest that pulls you into reaction before you've had time to think. The impulse may still appear, but it doesn't take over. It passes through a space that didn't exist before, a space created by awareness, by practice, by repeatedly choosing to see clearly instead of reacting automatically. And in that space, something holds, something steady, something that doesn't move as quickly as everything else around you. You begin to observe more, not in a detached or distant way, but in a grounded, attentive way. You notice what is said, but you also notice how your mind starts to interpret it. You notice what happens, but you don't immediately decide what it means. There's a delay, a brief moment where things remain open instead of being instantly defined. And that openness changes everything. Because once something is defined too quickly, it becomes fixed. But when you allow it to remain open, you give yourself room to see it more accurately. This shift is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like a breakthrough. It feels like a gradual settling, a reduction in unnecessary tension, a sense that you don't need to respond to everything with the same urgency as before. That not every situation requires a reaction, that not every word carries the weight you once gave it. And in that realization, something begins to loosen. You assume less. Not because you've forced yourself to, but because you've seen how often assumptions led you away from clarity. You've noticed how quickly the mind fills in gaps, how easily it creates stories that feel convincing but aren't always accurate. And once you've seen that enough times, you become more careful. not hesitant but precise. You allow things to be what they are before deciding what they mean. That precision changes how you experience emotion. You still feel, that doesn't go away, but the feeling doesn't expand beyond what is actually there. It doesn't pull in unrelated thoughts, past experiences, or imagined outcomes in the same way. It remains closer to the moment, more contained, more manageable. And because of that, it doesn't overwhelm you. It doesn't define your entire state. There's a kind of steadiness that starts to form. Not rigid, not fixed, but consistent. It doesn't depend on things going well. It doesn't disappear when something unexpected happens. It remains present, even as situations change. And that presence becomes something you can rely on, not because it's always strong, but because it's always there. This is where the idea begins to feel real. The idea that nothing and nobody can hurt you in the way they once did. Not because you've become immune to life, but because you've changed the way you engage with it. You've stopped handing over the authority to define your inner state. You've stopped allowing external moments to determine how you see yourself, how you feel about yourself, how you respond. That authority returns to you gradually, not all at once, not in a single decision, but through repeated moments of awareness. Each time you pause instead of reacting immediately, you take a small part of it back. Each time you question an interpretation instead of accepting it automatically, you strengthen that return. And over time, those small moments accumulate. What changes is not just how you respond, but how you see yourself within those responses. You no longer feel like someone who is constantly at the mercy of what happens. You begin to see yourself as someone who participates in the experience rather than being defined by it. And that shift, subtle as it is, changes everything. Because once you see yourself that way, it becomes harder for external events to take that sense of stability away. They can still affect you. They can still create moments of discomfort, frustration, even pain. But they don't reach the same depth. They don't disrupt the foundation in the same way. As Marcus Aurelius reflected, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. That strength is not loud. It doesn't need to prove itself. It shows up in quiet moments, in the way you respond, in the way you hold yourself when things don't go as expected. You stop needing to control everything in order to feel stable. You stop needing others to behave a certain way in order to feel secure. You stop needing constant reassurance to maintain your sense of self, not because those things are no longer pleasant or valuable, but because they are no longer necessary for your stability. There's a difference between preference and dependency. You can prefer that things go well, that people treat you with respect, that situations unfold in your favor, but you no longer depend on those outcomes to remain steady. And that difference gives you a kind of freedom that is difficult to disrupt. You move through situations with more clarity, more patience, more awareness. Not perfectly, not without moments of difficulty, but with a consistency that wasn't there before. And that consistency becomes your foundation. At that point, the world can continue as it always has. Unpredictable, imperfect, sometimes challenging. But it no longer finds the same points to disrupt you. Not because those points have disappeared, but because you've understood them. You've seen how they form, how they operate, how they can be influenced. And once you understand something at that level, it loses some of its power. Not completely, but enough to change your experience of it. Enough to create space where there was once immediate reaction. Enough to allow you to remain steady even when things are not. That steadiness is not something you achieve once and keep forever. It's something you maintain, something you return to, something you reinforce through continued awareness. But once it's there, even in a small way, it becomes a reference point, a reminder of what is possible when you see clearly. There comes a point where you realize nothing outside of you ever truly had the power you thought it did. It was never the world that needed to change. It was the way you saw it, the way you carried it, the way you allowed it to define you. And once that shifts, even slightly, you begin to move differently, calmer, clearer, harder to shake. Not because life got easier, but because you did. If this spoke to something real in you, don't stop here. There's another video on your screen right now that will take you even deeper into this path. Watch it and keep building that inner stability step by step.